My name is Clara, and my sister Nina is 2 years older than me. From the very beginning, she believed that being older meant she had to come first, no matter what. If I wanted something, she claimed it before I could. If I achieved something, she twisted it into a reminder that she should have done it first. Every step I took seemed to threaten her place, and she fought to keep herself ahead, even when there was no race to run. Our parents tried to treat us fairly. They never compared us, never held one of us higher than the other. When I brought home straight A's on every report card, they were just as proud of Nina's B+. They wanted us both to feel valued, even when our paths were different. Still, the rivalry grew. Our parents had a habit of punishing us in pairs, convinced that working side by side would teach us to get along. In their minds, shared chores were supposed to build bridges. In reality, they only sharpened the silence between us. Instead of bonding, we perfected the art of ignoring each other, turning every chore into a contest of endurance. What our parents saw as teamwork became another battlefield, proof that forced closeness only pushed us further apart. Birthdays were another battleground. Every year, Nina insisted my cake was better than hers, even though it was usually the opposite. I liked a simple chocolate cake, nothing fancy. She wanted elaborate designed strawberry swirls, frosting flowers, something that looked like it belonged in a bakery window. But no matter what she got, she found a way to complain, convinced mine had been made with more care. Outside the house, we simply avoided each other. At school, at parties, even at family gatherings, we kept our distance. It was easier than pretending we got along. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where in the world you are watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. I love seeing how far this little story can travel. Let's make this space feel a little more connected, no matter how many miles are between us. Then came high school. I hadn't even known that Nina had been rejected by the cheer squad. One afternoon, some friends and I thought it would be fun to try out, and, to my surprise, I made the team. That small victory infuriated Nina. She screamed at me in the hallway, demanding that I quit. It was the first time we had ever fought outside of home. When I told her no, that I wasn't going to give it up, she punched me in the face. A teacher saw the whole thing. I was taken to the nurse's office with a nosebleed, and Mom and Dad were called. The school suspended Nina for 3 days, followed by 3 more days of in-school suspension under their anti-violence policy. Our parents were furious. At home, she was grounded for a month, no phone, and the computer only allowed for schoolwork. I tried to ignore her after that, refusing to engage in her fits, but it only seemed to make her angrier. When she returned to school, Nina came up with a plan to trip me and break my leg. But she made a mistake. It wasn't me she tripped. Another girl went down hard, and her leg was broken. That was the final straw. Nina was expelled and had to finish the year at a different school. At home, Mom and Dad grounded her for the rest of the school year and forced her to get a job to help pay the girls' hospital bill. Eventually, she settled down. She managed to get into Baruch College while I graduated high school. And then came the moment that changed everything, my acceptance letter and a full ride to Princeton. Nina cried about how unfair it was, threatening again and again to call the school and tell them I had cheated. The drama escalated until Dad finally threatened to cut her off if she didn't stop. That's when she came up with a new plan. She would transfer there herself. A week later, she even booked a Princeton campus tour, strolling through the ivy-covered buildings as if she belonged, telling anyone who would listen that she was thinking about transferring. But we all knew the truth. Without my scholarship, neither of us could have afforded to dream about the Ivy League. Eventually, she seemed to let it go. But the resentment lingered, tucked away like a shadow that never quite disappeared. Over the next 3 years, life began to settle into its own rhythm. Nina finished her degree in accounting and landed a good job, something stable that gave her a sense of independence. Around the same time, I was studying business, focused on building my own future. That's where I first met Ethan. He was charming, strong, and brilliant, the kind of person who seemed to light up every room he walked into. At first, we were just friends. We studied together, shared notes, and occasionally grabbed coffee after class. Then one summer, by chance, we bumped into each other outside of school. He didn't hesitate. Right there, on the sidewalk, he told me he liked me and asked me out. From that moment on, everything shifted. We began dating, and over the next 2 years, our relationship grew into something steady and real. What surprised me most was Nina's reaction. For once, there was no rivalry, no jealousy. She was genuinely happy for me, smiling as she said, "You found a good one." And she meant it. Years later, all three of us, Nina, Ethan, and me, ended up living and working in New York City, the place I'd always called home. For a brief stretch of time, it felt as though we had grown up and, at last, became sisters. The old resentments slipped into the background, softened by something closer to acceptance. What had once been sharp edges between us began to dull, replaced by moments of recognition, small gestures, shared silences, that hinted at a bond we had both longed for but never quite trusted. Then came our 8th anniversary. Ethan had planned a dinner at the River Cafe, and to my surprise, when we arrived, my mom and dad were already there, along with Nina, his parents, and his grandmother. He said he wanted it to be a special night. After we sat down, the waiter handed me a glass of champagne. Just as I was about to take a sip, my dad leaned in with a goofy grin and said, "Clara, what's that in your glass?" I looked down and saw a ring. Ethan was already on one knee. "I've loved you from the first moment I saw you," he said. "So before our loved ones, I ask you, will you be my wife and partner in life?" Tears streamed down my cheeks as I nodded and whispered yes. His grandmother leaned forward, asking, "Did she say yes?" I pulled Ethan into my arms and said louder, "Yes, Grandma Smythe," I said yes. The family erupted in cheers. But even in that joyful bubble, I noticed Nina's smile didn't reach her eyes. There was a coldness there, though I brushed it aside as our mothers immediately began talking about wedding plans. Nina interrupted, saying, "Well, there's no rush. You'll want a long engagement." Everyone turned to her, puzzled. She added, "I mean, you'll want to do it right, and that can get expensive." Mom waved her hand dismissively. "My daughter, the accountant, don't worry, it will be beautiful," she said, and everyone chuckled. But Nina wasn't smiling. Over the next 3 months, whenever anyone mentioned my wedding in front of her, she would change the subject, or leave the room if she couldn't. It finally came to a head one evening when Mom asked Nina directly what her problem was. She folded her arms and said, almost casually, "I just don't see the point of all this talk when it's going to be years before she can get married." Mom and I exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" we asked together. Nina rolled her eyes. "Well, obviously you'll wait until I get married first. How will it look if my little sister gets married before me?" I stared at her in disbelief. "But you don't even have a boyfriend." She nodded, as if that proved her point. "Exactly. So I don't see the need for all this planning." I shook my head. "No, we're thinking next summer." She laughed like I'd just told a joke. "Next you're going to say June," she said, wiping a tear from her eye as she laughed. Still confused, I explained, "Ethan's family has a tradition. The wedding date matches the first date. His parents and grandparents did it, and I thought it was sweet. We've chosen June 22nd. Mom's eyes filled with tears. "That's lovely," she said softly. But Nina suddenly screamed, "Are you kidding me?" "Absolutely not." "Mom, tell her June is my month and I have to be married first." Dad walked into the dining room, startled by the noise. Nina turned to him with a look I hadn't seen since childhood and shouted, "Dad, they're trying to steal my wedding." He chuckled, trying to diffuse the tension. "Nina, honey, you're not even dating anyone." She shrieked, stormed out, and yelled over her shoulder, "You'd better change your mind." "I mean it. You'll regret it if you don't." We sat in stunned silence. Dad gave a nervous laugh. "What was that all about?" Mom shook her head. "I don't know. She has some silly ideas." The rest of the year, Nina kept her distance. At family gatherings we avoided each other, and my parents never forced the issue. Then came Christmas. On the 21st, Auntie Maria and Uncle John hosted their annual party. Nina showed up but drank heavily. On the 23rd, Ethan's family gathered before leaving for Aspen. On the 24th, Mom and Dad held their traditional dinner. By the time Christmas morning arrived, we wondered if Nina would appear at all. We woke at my parents' house, made brunch, and opened gifts. By mid-afternoon, as we prepared the feast that had always been served at 5, Nina finally arrived, stumbling in at 3:30, clearly drunk, clutching a single gift for me. She staggered toward Ethan and said loudly, "Tell her or I will right now." Then she laughed. Ethan frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Fine, I will," she said, lurching toward me. But before she reached me, she tripped. The gift burst open across the floor, dozens of photographs spilling everywhere. They showed Ethan with different women, entering hotels, kissing, embracing. Nina giggled. Oopsie. Uncle John bent down, picking up a few. At first the room froze. Then he held one up. "Look at this, 6 fingers." Another photo showed webbed hands. In the background of another, a man had 3 legs. Some of the timestamps overlapped with family events Ethan had attended. "These are AI fakes," he said firmly. Auntie Maria pointed out faint watermarks on several. Nina's face twisted. "No. I hired a private eye," she screamed. When confronted with the evidence, she lost control, shouting that the whole family was against her. Then she turned to me. "Have you changed your mind? Just wait for me to marry first. It's not too much to ask." I opened my purse and handed her the save-the-date cards we were planning to send out. She stared at the golden embossed lettering, then tore it in half. Through gritted teeth she said, "Fine. You leave me no choice. I'll get married on June 21st. Everyone will be partied out for your wedding." She pulled on her jacket, took a long swig from a flask, and spat, "Marry fuck you assholes." Then she stormed out. Mom chased after her. I watched from the doorway as they argued in the snow. Nina shoved Mom down before walking away. Mom stood, brushed herself off, and came back inside. Dad shook his head. "Is dinner ready? I've got an idea for a drinking game." We gathered the scattered photos. Mom and Auntie Maria said the meal was almost done. Uncle John poured cocktails. After dinner, Dad explained his game. You could only drink when you spotted an AI flaw in the pictures. Dinner was perfect, and the game turned something bitter into laughter. For one night, at least, we reclaimed joy from the chaos Nina had left behind. The new year slipped in quietly, without drama. Nina had been in touch with Mom, though she insisted she needed space. She swore she'd stopped drinking and said that was why she was avoiding New Year's Eve parties. It sounded reasonable enough. I even sent her a text asking if she would be my bridesmaid, but she never replied. Ethan told me to give her time, that once she calmed down, she'd want to stand beside me. Then the phone calls began. The first was from my grandfather, his voice tight with concern. He said he would do whatever it took to help me get back at Ethan. Confused, I asked what he meant. That's when he told me Nina had called him, claiming the wedding was off because Ethan had been cheating on me. I quickly assured him it wasn't true. I explained that Nina was furious about me getting married before her and the fact that I was doing it in June and how she had threatened to ruin everything. He listened, then promised he would call my parents to inform them what Nina was saying. But the calls didn't stop there. Later that afternoon, one of my cousins rang me in tears, saying she'd heard Ethan had left me because I had terminated a pregnancy. Another cousin called, claiming I had cheated on Ethan. I was stunned. "Where did you hear that?" I asked. They admitted Nina had told them, insisting she had proof. An hour later, another cousin repeated a different version. Each call carried a new twist, a fresh rumor, conflicting, contradictory, and none of them true. It was as if Nina were weaving a web of lies, each thread designed to pull someone else into her chaos. By the end of the day, half the family was confused. Some believed Ethan had betrayed me. Others were convinced I had betrayed him. I felt trapped in the middle of a storm I hadn't created. Every time I tried to explain, I sounded defensive, as though I was covering something up. The truth, that Nina was furious about me marrying before her and was determined to sabotage me, felt too unbelievable to some of them. After all, who would go to such lengths over who got married first? But I knew better now. I underestimated her. Finally, I decided the only way to cut through the chaos was to make a group chat with the entire family. I gathered everyone, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and laid out the truth. I posted screenshots of the conflicting stories Nina had been spreading. Each rumor carried the same theme: the wedding was canceled. As the messages poured in, the family began to piece it together. They compared what each of them had been told, realizing how wildly the stories contradicted each other. One cousin admitted she had been heartbroken, thinking Ethan had left me. Another said she had been angry at me, believing I had betrayed him. But when they saw all the lies side by side, the confusion gave way to shock. The chat lit up with disbelief. I can't believe she would go this far. Over the fact that her sister was going to marry first? This is beyond jealousy, it's sabotage. Even relatives who had tried to stay neutral were stunned. They couldn't understand how Nina could be so consumed by rage. For me, it was bittersweet. On one hand, I finally felt vindicated. My family believed me. On the other, it hurt to see just how far Nina had gone. By spring, Mom decided to host an engagement party for us. The house glowed with warmth, laughter spilling from the kitchen, glasses clinking, and the hum of relatives catching up. Halfway through the evening, Nina arrived. She floated in as though she were the guest of honor, her entrance pulling every eye toward her. It was the first time I had seen her since Christmas. In her hands was a stack of envelopes. Without explanation, she began handing out wedding invitations for her own wedding, scheduled for June 21st. On her finger gleamed an ostentatious ring, which she flashed proudly at anyone who looked her way. She gave one invitation to Dad, who was standing beside me, then turned toward me with another. Just as I reached for it, she pulled it back, laughing. "Oopsie, you're not invited," she said, her voice sharp with amusement. Dad frowned. "Who is this man? When can we meet him?" Nina's smile vanished. "Oh no, you will not ruin this for me. You'll meet him at the wedding." Mom tried gently. "What's his name? Who are his parents?" Nina spun around, her tone biting. "God, do you think you know everyone? You'll meet him at the wedding." That's when I noticed the glaze in her eyes, the way her words slurred just slightly. She was intoxicated. I stepped forward, trying to soften the moment. "Come have some coffee with me," I said. "Let's talk. I want you to be my maid of honor." She looked at me with a cold smile, then laughed. "Do you really think I'll stand beside you? I won't even be there." Auntie Marie and Uncle John stepped in, trying to ease the tension. "What about us?" Auntie said kindly. "I'd love to meet his mother. We could have tea at my place. We could even help plan your engagement party." Nina narrowed her eyes. "Or you could tell them how disappointing I am and convince them to cancel the wedding. Anyway, I haven't even met them, so you can't." One of our cousins spoke up, hesitant but firm. "If you haven't met his family, maybe you should get to know them before you marry into theirs." Nina turned on him, her voice sharp. "Not everyone has toxic, controlling family." Then she looked around the room, her gaze sweeping over all of us. "I take it back, none of you are invited." She walked out, the room fell silent, the celebration suddenly fragile. Her words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to wave away. We exchanged uneasy glances, each of us unsettled. Even though Nina seemed thrilled with her announcement, none of it sat right. The next month was filled with cake tastings and dress shopping, moments that should have been joyful but felt bittersweet. I had always imagined Nina would be beside me for these things, offering opinions, teasing me, helping me choose. Instead, her absence hung over everything. Then one afternoon, Mom called with a shaky voice. She had seen Nina at Macy's Herald Square with a dangerous-looking man. He had her cornered, gripping her arms tightly, speaking words Mom couldn't make out. As she moved closer, Mom heard Nina pleading, "It's not like that, you are my everything." "I'm sorry," before kissing him and promising she would be the best wife ever. That's when he balled up his fist and punched her in the stomach. Nina doubled over, gasping for air, while he looked down at her and said coldly, "I own you." Then he turned and walked away. Nina chased after him, promising she would be better. I didn't know what to say when Mom told me, but I promised her I would try to reach out. The next day, I went to the accounting firm where Nina worked, hoping to talk to her. Instead, I was told she had called out sick again. I raised an eyebrow. Again? The receptionist hesitated, then asked quietly, "You're her sister, right?" When I nodded, she lowered her voice. "I know I'm not supposed to share personal information, but we're afraid for her." She went on to explain that Nina had been calling out often, and when she did come in, she seemed distracted. Their boss had even threatened to fire her if her new boyfriend didn't stop showing up at the office. He would try to come inside, and when refused, he stood outside the door, interrogating every man who entered, asking if they were there to see his Nina. She had already lost a few clients, and others had threatened to leave the firm altogether. "He's scary," the receptionist said, her voice trembling. "And she seems scared of him too. But then she insists he loves her so much." I thanked her, told her we were trying to reach out, and left. But as I walked home, the weight of it pressed harder on me. I was more concerned than ever before. Then 3 weeks later, my aunt called and asked if I could join her and Mom for coffee. There was something she needed to talk about. I agreed, assuming it had to do with my wedding. When I arrived at the restaurant, they were already seated, looking at an iPad. Nina had blocked me, Mom, and Dad from her Facebook, so we hadn't seen the photos she had posted. My aunt showed me. Nina looked exhausted, with dark bags under her eyes, faint finger marks around her throat, and bruises peeking out from beneath her long sleeves. My aunt explained she had tried calling Nina, but a man answered instead. He demanded to know who she was and why she was calling, never letting her speak to Nina. So she went to Nina's workplace. When she confronted her, Nina laughed it off, saying it was her fiancé, Dan, who had answered while she was sleeping. As for the bruises, she brushed them aside with a wink. "Oh, Dan likes it a little rough," she said, laughing. And then I told them how Nina, the girl who had perfect attendance in school and was rarely late, had been calling in sick and her boyfriend had been harassing her clients. That's when Mom added that yesterday Dad had tried going to Nina's apartment, only to discover she had broken her lease and left no forwarding address. The landlord was furious, pacing in the doorway and threatening to sue her for damages. He demanded to know her new phone number and address, insisting he had a right to track her down. As Dad stood there, he couldn't help but notice the state of the place. There were holes punched into the walls, jagged plaster crumbling around them, and the front door looked as though someone had kicked it in. The frame splintered, the lock hanging loose. It was clear the apartment had seen violence. The landlord gestured toward the damage, his voice rising. "Do you see this? She left it like this. I can't rent it out in this condition." The image haunted me, Nina's life unraveling not just in whispers and rumors, but in the very walls around her. Desperate, I asked the waitress if I could borrow the restaurant's landline, since we were most likely blocked. I dialed Nina's number, hoping against hope. But all we got was an automated message. The number was no longer in use. The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't just that Nina had disappeared, it was the way she had vanished, leaving behind anger, debt, and unanswered questions. We left and headed to my parents' house. I called Ethan and asked him to join us, while Auntie Maria phoned Uncle John, her husband. Together, we made a plan. The next day at 5 o'clock, we would go to Nina's workplace, bring her home, and finally sit her down to get to the bottom of everything. But nothing went as planned. When we arrived, Nina stood stiffly, her arms crossed, her eyes cold. We tried to approach gently. Mom spoke first, her voice trembling. "Nina, we're worried about your safety. Please, just talk to us. We love you." Nina's gaze shifted to me, sharp and unyielding. "Have you canceled your wedding yet? If you think I'm in trouble, the answer is simple: change your date." I shook my head, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's too late now. We're only 3 months away. Family members have already purchased plane tickets, rented hotels. We'd lose all our deposits." Her lips curled into a bitter smile. "Then you've made your choice." Before I could respond, a man suddenly lunged forward. Dan grabbed my dad and punched him squarely in the face. The sound of the blow echoed, and Dad staggered back, blood dripping from his nose. "I never gave you permission to talk to her," Dan roared. "Who the hell do you think you are? She's mine." Uncle John and Ethan rushed forward, trying to intervene, but Dan was much larger than both of them. He shoved them aside with terrifying ease, his rage spilling over like fire. As he hissed, "Slut, get in that car before I kill everyone here." Nina didn't hesitate. She darted toward her car, but Dan slid into the driver's seat before anyone could stop him. She climbed in beside him, her movements frantic, almost desperate. We ran after them, pleading, "Nina, please. We're only trying to help you. We're scared for you." She rolled down the window, her face twisted with fury. "Stay out of my life. I hate you all." Then she turned to our parents, her voice dripping with venom. "This is all your fault." The words cut deeper than the punch Dan had thrown. And then, with Dan gripping the wheel of her car, they sped off, leaving us standing in the parking lot, stunned, broken, and at a total loss for words. The taillights disappeared into the night, carrying her farther away from us, farther into danger and farther from the family that still loved her. After that day, Mom and Dad weren't just scared for Nina, they were hurt. How could she say those things to them? Dad finally said we had to step back and let her come to us. Uncle John added, "There's nothing we can do if she doesn't want help. We just need to move on with our lives and be ready when she comes to her senses." I disagreed, but I didn't know what else to do. And with my wedding approaching, there was so much that demanded my attention. 2 days later, we were having supper at Mom and Dad's, trying not to think about Nina while also planning my rehearsal dinner when there was a knock at the door. Mom grabbed the tablet and opened the Ring camera. 2 police officers stood outside. Terrified, I ran to the door and opened it, blurting out, "Is Nina okay?" They looked at me startled. I quickly apologized, and they said they needed to speak with Mr. and Mrs. Miller. I led them into the kitchen. The taller officer cleared his throat. "William Miller and Dorothy Miller, can we talk privately?" The words hit me like a blow. I cried out, "He's killed her, hasn't he?" and collapsed into Ethan's arms. Dad steadied himself and said, "We can talk right here." That's when they explained. After Nina left with Dan, they had been fighting that night. A neighbor called the police, reporting a man beating his girlfriend. When officers arrived, they witnessed Dan punching and kicking her, screaming insulting names at her. She was completely unconscious. Daniel Johnson was arrested on the spot, and Nina was rushed to the hospital. She was recovering, but the injuries were severe: black eyes, 3 broken ribs, and a broken arm and internal bleeding. We all gasped. Then the second officer added, "The problem is, she insists she fell down some stairs. Even when we told her we witnessed the assault, she started saying it was her sister's fault. She refuses to press charges." Dad's voice shook. "Can she do that? I mean, not press charges?" The officer shook his head. "No. Because we witnessed the assault, the state prosecutor's office has filed charges. We'll be witnesses. He will go to jail," they said. "But for now, someone has bailed him out. She will be at Maimonides Medical Center for a few weeks at least, but when the time comes, they were hoping we could convince her to come home instead of returning to him. We promised to try, though we explained she had been fighting with us. They understood and gave us the name of the hospital for the second time, urging us to speak with the social worker there. When we arrived, Nina tried to have us removed. She screamed that it was our fault, that I needed to cancel my wedding, or else she would marry Dan on June 21st. Dad pleaded with her, saying this was bigger than who got married first, that she needed to leave him and come home, that he would protect her. Ethan added, "The police said he'll go to jail for this." But Nina shouted back, "No, he won't. I will not press charges, and that's that." Mom tried to explain gently, "It isn't your decision anymore. The state prosecutor's office has filed the charges." She just stared out the window, refusing to speak. Mom reached out gently, telling her how much she loved her and how worried she was. Nina finally turned her head toward me, her eyes cold. "This is all your fault," she said. "If you had just canceled your wedding, maybe I would have had more time to meet the right person. You forced me to rush the most important decision of my life. I am older and I have the right to be first, and then to steal June from me. My blood is on your wedding dress. Remember that when you walk down the aisle feeling all pretty." Then she turned back to the window, shutting us out completely. I was openly crying now. Mom and Dad looked broken, and Ethan held me close. We left Nina's hospital room in silence, my tears still fresh, and followed the signs down the hallway until we reached the office of the social worker the officers had mentioned. Mom hesitated outside the office door, her hand trembling before she finally knocked. A warm but steady voice called, "Come in." Inside, the social worker rose from her desk, her expression kind but serious. "Hello, my name is Jane Addams," she said, extending a hand before gesturing toward the chairs. "Please sit down. What can I do for you this afternoon?" Her tone carried both authority and compassion, the kind of voice that made it clear she had heard countless difficult stories before and was ready to listen to another. We settled into the seats, the weight of the past weeks pressing down on us. Dad cleared his throat, his voice heavy. "We're here because of our daughter, Nina. She's in one of the rooms down the hall. We don't know what to do anymore." I leaned forward, my words spilling out faster than I intended. "She's furious about my wedding. She wants to marry before me, and she's with a man who's hurting her. We've seen the bruises. We've heard him threaten her. He punched my dad in front of her, and she still defended him. She even told me her blood would be on my wedding dress." My voice cracked, and Ethan reached for my hand. The social worker nodded slowly, her eyes soft but steady. "I'm aware of Nina. I tried speaking with her earlier today. She wouldn't let me in, but I could see the fear behind her anger. She's caught in the cycle of abuse, defending him, blaming herself, even blaming you. That's what happens when someone is controlled by fear and manipulation." Dad leaned forward, his voice breaking. "What can we do?" "She won't listen to us. She won't come home. We're terrified she won't survive this." The social worker folded her hands. "You can't force her to leave him. What you can do is stay consistent. Keep reminding her she has a safe place to go. Don't argue about the wedding date or the details she throws at you. That's her way of deflecting. Focus on the truth. She is loved, she is not alone, and she deserves safety. When she's ready, she'll need you to be steady." She paused, then added, "We'll connect her with counseling and a domestic violence advocate. If she refuses, we'll still keep the door open. Sometimes it takes more than one crisis before someone accepts help. But your role is to be the anchor, calm, patient, and unwavering." Her words settled over us like a heavy blanket. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of direction. We couldn't save Nina by force, but maybe, just maybe, we could be the lifeline waiting when she reached for it. That night, I told Ethan we couldn't go on our honeymoon. I needed to be here for my sister. He agreed without hesitation. "Los Cabos isn't going anywhere," he said. Together, we decided I would keep my apartment after the wedding, in case Nina ever wanted or needed it. Later, I cried myself to sleep. The next day at my parents' house, we gathered to inform the extended family about what was happening. Some already knew Nina was upset with us, that she had rushed into this relationship, but we agreed she needed as much support as possible. Maybe one of them could reach her in a way we couldn't. Then the harassment began. First, Dan showed up at my parents' house after midnight. The Ring camera caught him, visibly drunk, shouting that Nina was his, that he owned her, and that if we didn't leave her alone, he would kill her. On the exterior camera, he was seen keying a neighbor's car parked on the street, apparently mistaking it for my dad's. Next, he appeared at Ethan's house. He hurled a rock through the kitchen window, screaming, "Stay away from my woman, or I'll kill your woman." When the police arrived, Ethan's neighbor handed over exterior camera footage showing the entire incident. Meanwhile, I began receiving text messages filled with vile insults and threats. He promised to kill me if I ever spoke to Nina again. We took the footage and my phone to the police, who said they would add the charges. Mom and Dad went to the hospital every day that first week, carrying with them the same plea, "Nina, this is wrong. You're in danger if you go back to him." They sat by her bed, trying to reason with her, reminding her of all the good family memories and how much we needed her, the way he was harassing not only her but them, and me too. At first, she listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Then she began to push back. It's only because I'm here, she insisted. He's upset because I'm stuck in the hospital. Once I'm discharged, he'll calm down. Her voice was sharp, defensive, as though she had rehearsed the line 100 times. Fear settled over us like a constant shadow. Ethan installed cameras around the house, and I moved into his place for safety. But Dan kept coming back. He never noticed the cameras, but they caught everything. Sometimes he stood in the driveway, smoking and staring, his silence more menacing than words. Other nights he urinated on Mom's flowers, a twisted act of defiance. And then there were the nights when his voice, thick with alcohol, filled the darkness, screaming threats, demanding that we drop the charges against him, as though it were ours to decide. His moods shifted like a storm. Sometimes he cursed us, sometimes he laughed, but often he said the most vile things about Nina and our family. Worse still, he would shout that someone should kill us, or that he would do it himself. Each time, he vanished before the police arrived, leaving only the footage behind. We handed over every clip, his file growing thicker by the week, but still he returned. The waiting became unbearable. Every night we braced ourselves, wondering if he would show up again, wondering how far he might go. The cameras became our only proof, but they couldn't stop the dread that settled in our bones. Then came the call that chilled us to the core. Dan had skipped his court date. He was missing. The fear deepened. It wasn't just the nights of shouting or the threats caught on tape anymore. It was the uncertainty of not knowing where he was or when he might appear again. When Nina spat out that her blood would stain my wedding dress, something inside me fractured. I couldn't bring myself to return to her hospital room after that. The cruelty of those words echoed too sharply, and I stayed away. Yet, even in my absence, love for her lingered. I was terrified of what Dan might do, terrified of what she might allow herself to endure. But beneath that fear was the sting of her anger, turned against me when all I wanted was for her to be safe. I carried both truths at once, devotion and dread, tangled with hurt until it felt impossible to breathe. Mom and Dad refused to give up. They took time off work and spent long hours at her bedside, reminding her how much she was loved, how desperately they wanted her to come home. They spoke of the life waiting beyond those hospital walls, of the family who would never stop fighting for her. They told stories from the past, trying to coax her back into conversation. But Nina never answered. She kept her face turned away, as if words themselves were too heavy to bear. Sometimes tears slid down her cheeks, quickly brushed aside as though she were ashamed to be seen. On rare occasions her eyes met theirs, fleeting moments of connection, but most of the time she stared out the window or into nothing, lost in a place they could not reach. Every so often, usually when she was crying, she whispered, "I'm tired. I need to sleep." And with that, Mom and Dad would gather their things and leave, walking out in tears, their hearts breaking a little more each time. One afternoon, Mom leaned close, her voice trembling, and told Nina about the harassment, that Dan wasn't just tormenting her, but us too. Nina brushed it off with a dismissive shake of her head. "He'll calm down once I'm out of here," she said, as if danger could be reasoned away, as if violence could be soothed by her presence alone. Mom tried again, her voice breaking. "Sweetheart, that's not how this works. He's dangerous. He's hurting you. He's hurting us." Dad leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly, as if holding himself back from shaking sense into her. "We're begging you, please see this for what it is." For the first time, Nina turned her head and looked directly at them. Her eyes were cold, almost calculating. "Is Clara still getting married?" she asked flatly. Mom and Dad exchanged a glance, hesitant, but finally answered, "Yes." Nina's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then you need to leave," she said, her voice low but firm. The words landed like a final verdict. Mom's shoulders sagged, Dad's face drained of color, and together they rose slowly from their chairs. Without another word, they walked out, carrying the crushing weight of rejection. Behind them, Nina turned her gaze back to the ceiling, shutting them out completely. The next day, when Mom and Dad arrived, the nurses stopped them at the door. "I'm sorry," one said gently. "She's asked that only her fiancé be allowed to visit." It was like a slap in the face. After all their effort, all their worry, she had blocked them out completely. Mom stood frozen in the hallway, tears welling in her eyes. Dad's jaw tightened, his face pale with disbelief. They had come every day, hoping to break through, and now they were shut out entirely. Before leaving, Mom and Dad pulled the nurses aside. Their voices were urgent, trembling with fear. "There's a warrant out for him," Dad explained. "He's dangerous. If he shows up here, you need to call the police immediately." The nurses exchanged uneasy glances, then nodded. One of them made a note in the chart, promising they understood. It was a small measure of comfort, but not enough to ease the ache. Mom and Dad walked out of the hospital knowing their daughter had chosen to shut them out, even as danger hovered just beyond the door. It was less than 2 months until my wedding, but I had lost all interest in it. How could I pick out flowers when all I could think about was whether we would be buying flowers for Nina's funeral instead? After long talks with Ethan, we decided to cancel the wedding, not forever, just not this year. We accepted that we would lose a lot of money in deposits and that it would take time to save again. We hoped the family would understand. In truth, we hoped that telling Nina we weren't going to rebook might finally bring her home. It had been 3 days since she blocked our parents from seeing her, so Ethan and I decided to have supper at Mom and Dad's house. The plan was simple: bring takeout, sit together, and figure out how to break the news to Nina. When I called Mom to tell her, she cried softly into the phone. "Thank you," she whispered. That evening, we gathered around the table. Mom and Dad agreed to help cover some of the deposits we had lost. As we talked, the idea grew bolder. Maybe we should just go to the hospital and force our way in, me leading the charge, telling Nina face to face that the wedding was off. We were laying out the plan, ready to head down there immediately, when a knock sounded at the door. On the tablet, we saw one of the police officers who had visited before. This time, he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was Jane Addams, the social worker from the hospital. Terrified, we let them in. Their faces were grave. Jane spoke first. "This morning Nina signed herself out against doctor's orders," she explained. "She's an adult, so legally we couldn't stop her. On her outpatient form, she claimed she was coming here. Is she here?" The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. We looked at one another. Had she been trying to reach us, knowing we would protect her? And if so, what had happened to her along the way? We explained that we had been planning to go down to the hospital ourselves. The officer nodded, his jaw tight. "That makes this a potential kidnapping case," he said. "We can issue a bolo, a be on the lookout, for Nina and Dan, operating under the assumption she's been taken against her will. Since her paperwork stated she was coming here, we have grounds. The charge might not hold in court, but for now, it gives us the authority we need to search for her." When the officer left, Jane Addams stayed behind. She sat with us like a quiet therapist, listening, reassuring, and trying to steady our panic. Her presence was calm, but the fear in the room was unmistakable. But when she finally went home, the silence in the house was unbearable. That's when we decided. The next day, we would go looking for Nina ourselves. If we had to knock on every door, we would. We would make flyers with her face, ask every person we saw, and refuse to stop until we found her. That night, Ethan and I stayed in my childhood room. We were too shaken to drive, and I couldn't bear to leave my parents alone. We tried to sleep, but none of us did. The house was heavy with fear, every creak of the floorboards reminding us of what was at stake. By morning, Mom had already made a mock-up flyer using the latest photo of Nina from her Facebook page. She had lost so much weight that she hardly resembled the girl in our older pictures. Ethan took the mock-up to his office, where an intern printed 1,000 copies. Meanwhile, we called as many family members as we could, recruiting anyone willing to help. By midday, the house was full of relatives, stacks of flyers piled high on the dining room table. We divided into groups and set out, starting with bars and liquor stores, convinced Nina and Dan were somewhere in Kensington, Brooklyn, close to Maimonides Medical Center, where she had last been. People who had worked with Nina or gone to school with her showed up to volunteer. Before long, Mom and Dad's house looked more like a headquarters than a home. It went on like this for a week, our search area growing wider each day. As busy as we tried to keep ourselves, Mom would still cry, telling anyone who came through the door that she knew her daughter was out there and that we had to find her. I cried every day too. More than once, I asked Ethan why I had been so stubborn, why we hadn't just changed the wedding date the first time Nina asked from her hospital bed. He was always the strong one. He just held me while I cried. Every night, we sat waiting, hoping Dan would make one of his attacks, but he never returned after Nina left the hospital. Each morning, Mom and Dad called the police for updates, but Dan seemed to have vanished. Then, on the 8th day at 7 p.m., we were called down to the police station. The social worker and 2 officers met us there. Their faces were grave. Dan had been found covered in blood. He had been refused service at a dive bar and attacked the bartender. A customer called the police, and 4 different witnesses heard him shout, "I'll do it again. I'm going to kill you." As officers pulled him off the bartender, he screamed, "Fuck you, Nina." They had his clothing and were testing to see if the blood belonged to Nina. Mom and Dad were asked to sign consent and release forms for the hospital. A court order had already been issued to test Dan's blood, as he was extremely high on some substances as well as alcohol. They were waiting for the results. Mom cried like a baby. I sat there stunned when both Dad and Ethan shouted in unison, "Where is Nina?" The officers admitted they didn't know. But they promised Dan would not be getting bail this time, especially since the bartender might not survive. "Rest assured," they said, "everyone is looking for her. But you need to stop the campaign. It might be dangerous." Dad nodded, his face hollow. "I don't want anyone else getting hurt." When we got back to my parents' house, we tried to explain what had happened to the volunteers. But it turned out someone had been live streaming at the bar, and the whole incident was already going viral. News outlets were reporting on it nonstop. As hard as it was to watch Dan beating that bartender, the way he most likely beat Nina, it had one effect we hadn't expected. The entire city was now looking for her. People never left. They gathered in prayer circles, brought food, and offered comfort. Mom and Dad lived in a state of shock. Mom would break down crying at the smallest reminder. She would stop in the hallway and whisper, "This is where she took her first steps." Or pause in the kitchen, tears streaming, and say, "Remember when she almost burned down the kitchen trying to make hot cocoa that Christmas?" The house we grew up in had become both a command center and a shrine, every memory of Nina sharpened by fear and longing. After 2 days, Nina had become the face of domestic violence. A GoFundMe page was set up in her name, and the story spread quickly. That's when the police came to us with news. A man from the South Bronx walked into the precinct, his voice uneasy as he explained what had happened. His neighbor had been violent toward his girlfriend, and when he tried to step in, she told him to mind his own business. It had sounded bad, but since she pushed him away, he chose to leave. After that, the apartment went quiet. Still, the memory lingered. And when he later saw Nina's story, guilt began to gnaw at him. He realized he should have done more, should have spoken up sooner. So at last, he came forward. The police followed his lead. When they arrived at the building, they found her. Nina had been beaten to death, so brutally that they suggested only Dad should see her to make the identification. She no longer looked like herself. Her wallet, with her driver's license inside, was found at the scene. The moment the words left their mouths, Mom fainted, collapsing where she stood. I dropped to the floor, screaming, "This is all my fault. I did this to her." The guilt tore through me like fire. Dad just stood frozen, his face blank, his body rigid, as though he had turned to stone. One officer rushed to help Mom, while another brought in some of the volunteers who had been with us, trying to comfort us in the chaos. Ethan stepped forward quietly, guiding Dad out of the room so he could do what none of us could bear: identify her body. Dad did identify her, though they also relied on her dental records. She was so disfigured that even he struggled to recognize her. The week that followed was a blur. I cried nonstop, drowning in guilt, whispering over and over, "This is my fault. I did this." One afternoon, Mom, shaken and exhausted, said quietly, "Well, I'm glad you see this." The words cut deep. Later, she apologized, admitting it wasn't anyone's fault. Nina had made up her mind, and nothing we did or didn't do could have changed that. Mom's sister, Auntie Maria, the same auntie who had been there from the very beginning, stepped in and took charge of the GoFundMe, with her husband, Uncle John, at her side. Donations poured in: flowers, money, offers of help. One venue even offered their space for free. News outlets reached out, wanting to air the funeral. Everything was arranged while Mom and I drifted through the days like ghosts, barely able to function. Ethan was the only one who kept trying to anchor me, repeating that it wasn't my fault. But I couldn't believe him. One day, I looked at him through tears and said, "Her blood is on my wedding dress," before walking away, sobbing. All of our vendors from the wedding returned our deposits in full of kindness that stunned us. The caterers not only refunded the money, but donated the wedding menu to the wake, transforming the steak dinners into trays of steak appetizers. And then came the most unexpected gesture: our wedding venue. They didn't just offer themselves for the wake, they moved the wedding that had been booked on June 20th to the 22nd so that we could have the space. It was an act of compassion that gave us room to grieve, to gather, and to honor Nina in a place meant for celebration. We held Nina's funeral on June 21st, her wedding day, the day before mine was meant to be. Someone had donated a beautiful wedding dress to bury her in. The coffin was closed, but an image was created, a photograph of Nina from before, dressed in the gown, blown up and placed beside her coffin. She looked stunning, radiant in a way that reminded us of who she had been before the violence consumed her. There were cameras recording, but the focus was on the people who loved her. Friends and co-workers stood to speak, sharing memories of her laughter, her kindness, her determination. The preacher spoke of love, of peace, of how Nina was finally free from pain. It was a funeral, but it felt like a wedding too, a day meant for beginnings turned into an ending. And yet, surrounded by flowers, voices, and prayers, Nina was remembered not for how she died, but for how deeply she was loved. Over the next 6 months, the case moved through the system with a grim momentum. The young bartender, Maya Alvarez, had survived 2 days in hospital before succumbing to her injuries. Her death, captured on the same video that showed Daniel Johnson's attack, became a pivotal piece of evidence. Prosecutors presented a tightly argued sequence: witness statements placing Johnson at the bar, the live stream and security footage showing the assault and his repeated threats, DNA evidence from blood on his clothing that matched Nina, and the recorded threats against our family that had been captured on the surveillance cameras we'd set up. The indictments were compounded by past convictions and complaints, multiple domestic violence incidents, and assault charges that established a dangerous pattern. At the grand jury, the charge sheet grew to include 2 counts of second-degree murder, 1 count for Nina, 1 for Maya Alvarez, and additional counts related to stalking and threats. The prosecution emphasized the totality of the evidence: video footage, forensic results, eyewitness testimony, the Bolo report that had set the search in motion, and Johnson's prior record. The defense tried to contest the chain of custody on some items and argued intoxication and lack of intent on others, but the forensic links, blood on clothing, matched DNA, and the unmistakable audio from the videos proved decisive. The jury returned guilty on all major counts. At sentencing, the court considered the aggravating factors: the brutality of the attacks, the pre-existing history of violence, the credible threat Johnson posed to multiple victims, and the public nature of the crimes. Given the statutory framework and the severity of the convictions, the judge imposed 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The clerk read the terms with the quiet, procedural cadence of the law. The sentence closed the criminal chapter, though nothing could close the loss. The law did its part. Evidence was tested, a jury heard the facts, and a sentence was imposed that reflected the full scope of the harm. Now the remaining work is less about proving what happened and more about living forward, managing claims, honoring the dead, and translating that legal finality into the long, quieter labor of repair. I was too emotionally drained to return to work. My boss was kind, saying, "Reach out when you're ready," but I wasn't sure when that moment would ever come. I'd been keeping my apartment as a quiet promise to Nina, saving that space for us, for the life I had hoped to help her find again, but now there felt like no point in holding on to it. The lease had always been month to month, so I let it go, closing the door on a space that once held hope but now only echoed loss. Our weeks became structured around therapy, each day carrying its own weight. On Mondays, Auntie Maria and Uncle John sat beside Mom and Dad in the family group sessions. The therapist guided us through the hardest truth. We had each done the best we could. At first, the words felt awkward, almost too small to hold the enormity of what had happened. But slowly, with honesty, we began to say them out loud. Uncle John and Dad carried a raw guilt for stepping back after the physical altercation, and the therapist helped them name the fear and shame behind that choice. We learned to hold their regret without turning it into blame. Wednesdays were for digging into older wounds. Mom, Dad, and I faced the tangled story of sibling rivalry, how small competitions and long-running resentments had shaped choices and silences. We practiced telling the story differently, not to punish each other, but to understand how patterns repeated, how each of us had been trying imperfectly to keep everyone safe. Fridays belonged to Ethan and me. Couples counseling was practical and tender, a place where we tried to find our way back to each other. We learned to grieve together without erasing each other's pain, to hold separate losses while still choosing connection. He was steady in ways I needed. I needed space to grieve on my own terms. The rest of the week was filled with individual sessions. Each of us carried private burdens into those rooms. For me, it was guilt, constant, corrosive, replaying Nina's last hospital days like a film with missing frames. My therapist helped me unpack those thoughts, showing how guilt had braided itself with shame and the belief that punishment was deserved. Slowly, I learned to name those feelings, to separate responsibility from fantasy, and to use concrete tools, naming intrusive thoughts, grounding in the present, refusing to let unbearable memories define me. The work was slow, but it gave me language, a way to live with grief without being consumed by it. The hardest moment came when the wedding date returned as a question. Ethan asked when we could start planning again. I suggested May 15th, my sister's birthday, so the day could be ours, not haunted. He wanted to keep the original date, tied to our first date, a family tradition he saw as reclaiming happiness. What began as logistics revealed incompatible ways of surviving grief. In quiet, exhausted agreement, we decided to break up. It wasn't dramatic, it was necessary. Losing that future was another grief layered on the first, and I carried it back into therapy, learning to name this loss and make room for whatever comes next. Now, 6 months in, my days are measured in small progress, one coping skill used, one old narrative I refuse to repeat. The house is quieter in a different way. Some days are functional, Mom can wash dishes without breaking down. Other days, guilt still rises, but less like a tidal wave and more like a tide I can step back from. We are learning to mark time not by the dates we lost, but by the small things we can choose: a homework exercise completed, a call returned, a walk taken without collapsing into fear. Nothing is fixed. But there are threads, people who stayed, a therapist's steady voice, Auntie Maria calling every day, that make the hard work feel possible. Last week, a letter arrived that made the house fall silent. It was from the life insurance company connected to Nina's job. She had named me as the beneficiary. I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in my hands. The paper suddenly got heavier than it should have been. The payout would have been modest, enough to be practical, not enough to change anything, but because she was murdered, the policy included a clause that tripled the amount. I read the letter once, then again, the words blurring as if they carried more weight than paper should. The payout felt like a contradiction, at once a gift from Nina, proof she had thought of me, and a cruel reminder of how even love could be reduced to clauses and numbers. That night we sat together in the living room, the air heavy with silence. Auntie Maria kept her hand on Mom's shoulder, while Uncle John leaned forward, his palms pressed against his knees as though bracing himself. Dad stared at the floor, and Mom's eyes stayed fixed on nothing at all. We began listing options, covering bills, creating a scholarship, building a memorial fund, but each suggestion fell flat, hollow against the enormity of what had happened. It was clear none of those choices carried the meaning we were searching for. Finally, I said, Nina would want it to mean something that could help someone else. The words surprised me with their calm. We looked at one another, and the choice rose naturally out of the ache we carried. Together, we opened an interim home, somewhere safe, with access to counseling, information, referrals to community resources, and programs designed to support residents and their children. In the days that followed, we posted a family statement online, on social media and the GoFundMe page. It was imperfect, a public gesture shaped by grief, but it was the only way we knew to speak. Each of us found a role that matched the part of ourselves most desperate to act. Some organized, some wrote, some listened. In our shared sorrow, we built something that could hold others, even as we struggled to hold ourselves. 8 months out, the money hasn't fixed anything that matters most. But it changed the shape of our grief. It gave us a place to show up without the performative exhaustion of answering the same questions, a place to put our hands and have them do something that mattered. It connected us to survivors who reminded us that pain could be held and that help could be given. Thank you for listening to my story. I write this not just for healing, but to keep Nina's memory alive. If you've been through something similar, I invite you to share your story below, because every voice matters and no one should carry this alone. Help is available and reaching out can make a difference. Together, we can honor those we've lost by choosing connection and support.